Thank you, Ken. So my name is Matt Cott. I'm with Barron's and Associates Environmental Noise Control. I'm out of the Denver office. We have facilities throughout the U.S. and Canada. And with me is Zach Birch. He's a communications manager for Naples Airport. Um, okay, he's signaling me to put the mic closer. What we're going to talk about today is some of the things that we run into with noise issues. Zach's going to go into some of what he sees at the airport with different changes that happen and complaints and what they do about some of these issues. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the codes and what we see with different codes throughout not just Florida but the U.S. and how those apply to um, getting people in compliance versus some of the other issues that we see with additional complaints that aren't necessarily regulated. Talk a little bit about some of the processes that are, best management practices, how to assess these different types of projects, whether it's at an airport or construction project, a water line replacement, anything to do with infrastructure, and then look at some of the different solutions that are out there on the market that we see around the U.S. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Zach, and he's got some slides to run through, and I'll let him get going.
All right. Good morning. Thank you for having me. Welcome to cold Miami. My name is Zach Birch. I'm the communications manager from the Naples Airport. If you're not familiar where Naples is, it's basically directly across the state on the Gulf side. And if you know anything about the Naples Airport, for anyone who's familiar, well, if you know anything about Naples, for one, yes, we know your grandparents live there. And two, we are a very noise-sensitive airport as it relates to aircraft noise, but also some impacts that we have from some of our development projects. And so here's kind of how it started and how it's going around the airport. The airport was built 80 years ago as a World War II Army base to train fighter pilots. You can see there on the left in the mid-40s, it was desolate. There was nothing around us. This was built out in the swamp where nobody could have ever expected that anybody would ever live. And now we are on the right, you can see, completely surrounded by primarily residential development. There's a small industrial park to the northeast of us, but primarily we're surrounded by residential and really high-end residential development. If you know anything about Naples, it's a very affluent community. Every home that you can see on that map is somewhere between $1 million and, well, actually, if you saw the news, in Naples, we have the new highest price real estate listing in the country, $295 million for 9 acres right on the Gulf. So it's a very affluent community, and we deal a lot with aircraft noise from overflights, but there are some other issues that I think are pertinent to this crowd. And just as background too, I've worked for the Airport Authority for 3 years. Before that, I worked for FDOT for 8 years, dealing with roadway noise a lot, so I have a background in that as well. Here's another sort of perspective. So you can see that's the airport in the middle. People act like they have no idea that there was an airport there, and I'm like, we're really the big X on the map. Like, it's hard to miss us. You can see our proximity to the Gulf there, less than a mile from the Gulf. The water to the north of us, or that would actually be to the west of us, but on the top of the map there is the Gordon River. 2 years ago during Hurricane Ian, we were completely flooded. We had 4 feet of water over the whole airfield, but it really, I think, gives you a perspective of how close the homes are around us. So this is our heat map of our jet departures, and so you can see they are fairly concentrated as you get around the area, and you can see really the much higher intensity to the northeast and southwest. That's our primary runway 523. It gets about 90% of our flights. The crosswind runway there, 1432, gets about 10%. And so, having worked at the Department of Transportation and also here at the Airport Authority, I can tell you that people don't like noise, but they really don't like unexpected noise. And so if you were to live to the northwest or the southeast of the airport, you experience some aircraft noise, but not a tremendous amount. It comes and it goes, predominantly in the winter when we have cold fronts, and we get the wind shifts that make us use the other runway. But there are other times when we have to make changes to runway use, and a lot of that has to do with some of our construction projects. Earlier this year, we started a drainage project alongside our primary runway 523, and that resulted in us having to close the primary runway at night for about 6 months. And so every night at 8 o'clock, I think, we would close that runway and we would force everyone to use 523. We did a pretty good job of notifying our tenants and our customers, because obviously which runway is open, which taxiways are open affects them in terms of their aircraft operations. But one of the things that we probably failed to an extent in is realizing how much that would impact the communities around us. Because those folks who live on northwest and southeast, they weren't as used to seeing those nighttime flights. We work really hard to prevent nighttime operations as best we can, but FAA regulations won't let us prohibit them. And so we didn't really take that into consideration. And so the very first night that we had that closure, we got tons of calls and complaints from our residents, from some of our customers who weren't aware, but also from one of our commissioners who happens to live to the northwest, and it led to a lot of complaints, a lot of issues. We quickly realized that we had a problem, because while the project itself in the basically dead center of the airport really had no noise effect on the community, the ripple effect of those runway use changes had a dramatic effect. And so we went out and really did a full court press on notifying the public, especially in that northwest-southeast quadrant. Use a lot of different formats. MailChimp is a great one, or other mail such systems that you can use. It not only lets you send these messages, design them, but also track open rates, click-through rates if you're trying to get some of those things. So it's great to be able to keep track of those. Everbridge is a system we use primarily for emergencies. So we try to limit it as much as possible, because we want people, especially our tenants and customers, to really take it seriously. But it's a great one. You can send direct emails and texts to people to let them know about things. We post it on our website, blindnaples.com. We use social media to really put it out there. And once we did that, and once the community was much more aware of the fact that this was going to happen, you really saw a much more understanding from the community about that. Subsequently, we determined that really there was a need for some improvements in our processes internally, and that document you see there, which isn't important that you read, but that's our new procedure. We came up with our standardized airport activity communications procedure. It was me and actually another speaker from the airport you'll hear, I guess, in about an hour or so, Barry, who's our director of operations. We worked on it, and it basically sets out the guidelines internally for us. Okay, what is it that requires notification, and to what extent, based on project length, anticipated impacts. There's a lot of criteria that go in there. And it really is kind of our guideline. And so our ops folks are much more cognizant of the fact that they need to let us know in the communications office if there's going to be projects that have these effects. And we're much more aware of, okay, there is a dramatic need for us to let people know. And so that's really what we do on that. And we do a lot of other outreach about aircraft noise, overflights, all those kind of things, not necessarily specific to infrastructure and construction. But this one I thought was kind of pertinent, because I think the key message is, one is you need to communicate. You really need to communicate with the public, and that's what we did when I worked at DOT, for example. We would literally walk corridors and go business to business and let people know what was going to happen, whether it was about lane closures, road closures, median openings that are going to be closed, or noise impacts, anything that's going to impact residences or businesses. You need to let them know, and you need to have a plan for when you're going to do it. And that's, I think, kind of the key takeaways from my end, certainly. And I'm happy to answer any questions or anything like that. But I think it applies both to airports, and also to remember that the impacts may not be just from the project themselves. The project may have those kind of ripple effects that you didn't necessarily anticipate, but end up being way more impactful than the actual construction work. So,
So yeah, I think you nailed it. The community outreach is definitely a big part of it. Um, and as you mentioned earlier, complaints, don't necessarily come when uh, noise is out of compliance. They come when you hear something that you're not used to hearing. So whether it's airplanes or if it's a construction project, they weren't expecting to hear backup beepers in the middle of the night. So the next thing I want to just run through real quick is some of the different types of noise codes. Pull this up here. And so what we've typically found for successful projects is when you kind of marry this all together. So you have whatever the applicable code. And what we did is we just pulled up a couple sample codes here just for some local stuff. So I think the most successful is when you look at how do we become compliant? What steps do we have to take to be able to show for whether it's for permit applications or, agreements with the community, but also looking at those things like the community outreach, um, Zach mentioned. So when you do that, you're setting reasonable expectations. Even with the most stringent codes in the world, you're never going to make it so whatever you're doing is completely silent. So being able to go out ahead of time and saying, here's how loud it already is, here's how loud it's going to be, this is what we're going to meet code. One of the issues, and you can't see without my glasses, is you see a bunch of different types of codes. So in general, most of the codes are going to be in what's called DBA. We did see that some of these look at both DBA and DBC. Just, you go down the road a few miles and the requirements are completely different. So, and I don't know how many people in here deal with this or are familiar with this, but throughout the country, there's thousands and thousands of different codes. So up front on a project, it's really important to understand what the actual requirements are for getting permits approved.
And I think I think even complicated even further, right? So if anyone else in here who's in aviation knows, the FAA uses DNL, which is
Yes.
24-hour day-night averages. California has their own code for the CNEL, so they have their own as well. So there's a lot of different ways that noise is measured, and depending on where you are, it can change dramatically, or what industry you're in.
Yeah. A good example is we just worked on a project in Pennsylvania, and they use an L90, which basically takes 10% of the noise and excludes it. So even though if you were to look at what the background noise is and there's heavy vehicle traffic, they just take all of that out. So you have to design this location, but you don't get the benefit of saying like, well, every time a truck goes by, it's out of compliant because they're excluding that noise 10% of the time. So it is very goofy. And so we really try to understand the codes and look at, how to have an overall successful project. So, and like he said, there's a million different ways to measure this. You also have to look at some projects want you to measure at your property line. Some of them are at a receptor's property line. Some of them are a set distance in between. So click through a couple of those. And so one thing I did want to show, and you guys may be familiar with this, but just real basic part of our acoustics 101 deal is what is DBA? So if you were to take, like you go on iPhone and download like a dB meter, if it just says dB, what that's going to be is it's going to look at whatever you're measuring. It's going to look at all the frequencies, weight them equally, and come up with an average that's dB. So what you typically see in a noise code is what's called DBA. So DBA is a filter that adjusts to the sensitivity of the human ear. So for example, if you're trying to be compliant with an airport noise problem or replacing a water line in the middle of a neighborhood, they're typically going to have this in DBA. The problem, the way that works is if somebody was out blowing a dog whistle at 10,000 hertz, humans can't hear that, so they don't include that in the average. So it adjusts a lot of the real high and real low frequencies out. So 99% of the time, any of these codes are going to be DBA. What it doesn't take into account is if you have engines and you have mufflers running, like exhaust, a lot of fan noise. So if it's, big chiller units, things like that, they tend to have a lot of low frequency. And so, for example, a giant fan on top of a facility next to a neighborhood, that might all be at 25 hertz. So before they include that in the average, they'll take 40 to 50 decibels off. So you get a much different type of reading. So some of the codes that we've seen down here actually use DBC as well. And so DBC is kind of more inclusive of low frequency. So a few different things to look at. And I don't know with the airports if it's straight DBA or if they look at some of that or intermittent noises.
Yeah, pretty much everything we do has to do with DNL. I mean, that's the only thing that the FAA recognizes.
Yeah.
So, we have noise monitors, portable noise monitors that will move around the community upon request. Those typically look at the LEQ, so the kind of the noise spikes that they are.
Yeah.
We set our threshold in the community for a noise event at 65 decibels.
Yep.
That's kind of an industry standard in aviation. It's really the kind of the point where conversation is disrupted, normal conversation. So that's kind of what we use, although that's not necessarily official. But the FAA uses nationwide is a 65 DNL is what they consider impactful noise. Our community, both our city and our county, have adopted the 60 as their threshold. So that's what we are able to use for our noise study. We just completed a 4 or so almost year noise study earlier this year, kind of late last year, and submitted it this year. And so we've come up with a number of recommendations for flight procedure changes, some land use changes as well, that we've submitted to the FAA for their approval. But for $2 million, we'll see what we get out of it. But it's a lengthy and difficult process, and DNL in particular. From an area, and anyone who's in an aviation field here knows it's a very difficult thing to explain to the community, because you may have a 90 decibel aircraft that goes over, but if you don't have something that goes over for another hour after that, it gets averaged out to almost nothing.
Exactly.
And so when we put our noise contours out, which are sort of these squiggly lines around the airport, people go, I hear 65 decibels way outside of that, and I'm sure you do.
Yes.
I'm sure you do, but when you average it out over the whole day and over the whole year, especially in a seasonal place like we live in, it's a very difficult concept to explain.
And this is again where it's very important for the community outreach, because all these codes do vary. Even when somebody does their homework and says, okay, I see that there's a code for City of Fort Lauderdale, it's 65 dBA. They assume that at any point in time, you can never go over that. And a lot of times, like he said, it's an average over 24 hours or a day. So that community outreach is a really good way to talk to the community and say, here's how the actual code works. Because what we see a lot is, somebody is out there and they see it goes to 67 dBA and they screenshot, and then that gets on, TikTok or MySpace or whatever. So
all those MySpace users out there.
That's my go-to for the older group. So, but yeah, so you can really create issues within the community. How many?
No. I just wanted to jump in. So Hannah, unfortunately, was unable to join us.
Yep.
Can I ask you a question, even though I said no questions?
Sure.
Okay. Not exactly. So for the better part of 20 years, I lived in New York. Right?
Yep.
Sound's a huge issue, right? So there was a time I lived on 38th and 2nd Avenue, where Washington repairs the Midtown zone.
Okay.
Absolutely drove me nuts.
Yep.
Got used to it. Same living on Houston Street downtown, where I would go out to the country and I couldn't sleep because it was too quiet. Okay. So I personally, when I was on 38, tried to do some things around this major project that was
Okay.
being fixed because of Sandy back in 12, right? So how does your organization engage with the public sector? I mean, it seems like there's multiple layers here, but how can your organization help to take action to address some of these issues that are in major cities around airports? You have
Mhm.
I'm just going to speak from about New York. You have planes flying over Queens if you're going into LaGuardia. This is a major issue. So how do you engage with the agencies that would be in the room
So
around this sort of thing?
So the first part of that, New York City, so the 5 boroughs, anything with noise related goes through the New York DEP.
Yep.
the New York DEP has a very, I guess I would call it weak plan for noise assessments. What you have to do with them is you have to fill out a one page, like if you're doing a construction project and you're across the street from houses or a hotel, the contractor is required to fill out a one page piece of paper. And normally what they do is they have to put some kind of acoustical blankets on an 8-foot high fence, and then they get approved to work. So obviously when you have a 30-story high apartment building and you're working 24 hours a day, it doesn't do a whole lot. So we've actually been engaging with the DEP lately to show them that there's other options, because the New York's a little different. Like normally if this was in Southern California and they were doing the same project, the city would say, we want to make sure that the noise code is met and we want to have community outreach and all that. And you would have to do a pretty comprehensive assessment to say, we've looked at all the noise impacts. It's different in New York City. So dealing with those kind of municipalities and saying, hey, let's talk about your noise code and where the deficiencies are, what can be done better, what's more realistic. I mean, part of it too is some of them, have wording in there like you can't have any complaints, which is just, that's impossible to do. And then also, there's areas, we're doing a lot of work in Shreveport, Louisiana, it's all oil and gas. And we've been pushing back on the regulatory group because they want to make it so restrictive that nobody's going to want to drill there. So it's kind of a two-way thing. So we do spend a lot of time with the municipalities, especially when there's rewrites of regulations, just to say like, this isn't going to work. This works in Fort Worth, Texas. This didn't work in New York City. So we have a lot of background on how to kind of do some of the wording in here so that it's doesn't push contractors out, but it also isn't too weak where it's just ineffective and you still get complaints anyways. So hopefully that answered it.
I think so. I just wanted to jump in because we were listening in here. But
Yeah.
does any city, municipality, agency here have noise issues that you're dealing with and that they're looking to address? Better raise your hand.
Man, you guys are lucky.
I was kind of hoping that every single hand would raise here.
Apparently, there are no airports here.
So I'll show you a couple pictures. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but we've been getting stuff in Florida about pickleball court noise, waste to energy sites. So there are some hands.
Yeah,
Come on, don't be afraid.
Naples was on Jeopardy last night. If anybody was watching, and said, "What are you?"
So-
this city in Florida is known for being the pickleball capital of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have
Yeah.
the world championships every year.
So, yeah.
It's still new.
I need to get the crowd going. Like, who likes Taylor Swift or something? Everybody raise your hand and just get used to it. So, but all right, I'll continue on. So the other thing that we tend to look at is what's called a pure tone. So again, when you have a regulation and it just looks at like dBA, it's averaging all these frequencies. So something like a backup beeper is considered a pure tone. It's very audible and it's designed to always be audible. So even when you look at like a code requires 60 dBA, that kind of gets lost in the average. So you can still be compliant. I was talking to somebody earlier about implementing electric buses in some program, but they have to put some kind of alarm because if you're hard of hearing, you're going to get hit by a bus. You don't hear it coming. So that introduces a whole nother thing. So it's a safety thing, but also now going to electric buses to have it be quiet, you still going to have impacts that people are going to hear all night long. So that's another one of the things that typically generates complaints, so that we try to look at up front. I'm going to have to kind of go through these a little quicker. How much time do we have left, Ken? 3 minutes? Okay. So the way that this stuff gets looked at, typically anytime there's a project, what you want to do is understand what your noise sources are. You can do, and just like he showed with the airport, you can basically run what's called a noise model. So you can plug in all your noise sources, and this is whether this is a water well drilling project or anything that makes noise, roadway, anything like that. You can do mapping. It takes into account the topography, ground cover, all that kind of stuff. It'll show you whether you're compliant or not. And then the next step would be to implement either permanent, temporary sound control, different types of enclosures, swapping, mufflers, things like that, and be able to see the results. So lots of samples on things like that. This is just some freeway noise impact. So adding additional lanes, what's the additional noise and vibration going to be? Continuous monitoring, similar to what they would use. So if he has his threshold at 65 dBA, you can set a trigger at 65. So when people call and say, hey, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I think it went over 65, you can go back and listen to the wave files and say, is an ambulance or something like that. Also tie in weather, frequency, content, all those things. A lot of times the compliance measurements will be tied to a certain wind level, and also if there's rain or snow. Well, no snow down here. I'm from Colorado, but you never know. Maybe there's a freak storm. So, and then just some of the things that we see for sound control that you've probably seen for like the highway barriers. There's a few things we look at. There's STC rating. So in general, that's how much noise is going to go through a barrier. And then NRC, which is how much noise reflects back. So a lot of times what you'll see is when you have a big concrete barrier, because it has an NRC of probably 0, 100% of the noise reflects back and could potentially cause issues back the other direction. And then like with the highway barriers, the biggest thing is height. So if you want to eliminate getting complaints from 3 blocks back behind those highway barriers, you really need to try to figure out how to get additional height on the walls. And then just a couple pictures of some of the typical installs you see around any of these products. I mean, there's our stuff as well as a number of others. Everything's engineered, PE stamp drawings, wind loads up to 150 miles an hour, no concrete required. Typical, installations, that's a water line replacement, blankets. There's stuff that you can see equipment gets right up close to houses. When you can't drill holes, there's products out there that utilize concrete jersey barriers or K-rail barriers, graphic overlays, a little bit of everything, data center stuff. So just a whole array of products that are out there. And here's some of the pickleball stuff. So we're having to actually incorporate like clear acoustical vinyl so that you don't block line of sight.
So I was just gonna say, I think to your point about all these options and the modeling, I think the critical point is to whether you're doing that, sort of high tech modeling, whether you're just going and really evaluating your community's needs, is that there's not necessarily a one size fits all. Every project is different. Every circumstance is different, whether it's a roadway project, a bridge. When I was at DOT, the solution for roadway noise is 22-foot tall concrete barriers, right? That's what you put up, but that doesn't work for an airport because the noise comes from 5,000 feet above you. So, there's different solutions, there's different concepts, and everything is really kind of project or context specific. So I know I mentioned that me and Barry, who's here now, came up with that procedure on how we evaluate impacts and what the outreach is, but that's really kind of the base, right? From there, you then have to go, okay, well, how far out do we need to go? Who do we need to notify? What's the best way to do it? In an older community, is Twitter the best way to do it? Maybe not. MySpace. How best can you get in touch with those folks, and what's the best way to get through to them and explain those things and get feedback as well. So it varies. Every project, every circumstance is different, and your response and your plan and whether it's physical barriers or outreach, I think they need to be kind of customized and tailored to each individual instance, and not just sort of, here's our plan. We have a project, we put out these. That's not going to work. Sometimes it will, but a lot of times it won't.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's all we got. Are there any questions?
We'll be here if you have any afterwards.
Was there one question back there?
Yeah, just for people writing codes, and you were saying different municipalities have different codes. Are there any kind of tips on what's kind of the best kind of ideas that should be put into codes for this type of thing?
So
There's all different measurements and there's averages and all the things you talked about.
So it can be tricky because a lot of times, like a municipality will want to handle that in-house. So if you're a small municipality, it's difficult to write a complicated code that actually makes sense for, the contractors and the public. if you've got one guy, or if it's the police officer is the compliance officer, it makes it very difficult for them to start looking at, oh, are they out of compliance? How did they do it this frequency or this or that? So a lot of times what you'll see is that gets subbed out to like a third party that says, okay, have somebody show us that you're compliant. But in general, there's some different things. We've done some studies with like that low frequency. So DBC in general, it's 65 DBC across the board, across the world. There's some kind of normal numbers that you see, 50 to 55 dBA at a property line is pretty normal. The biggest thing is you have to write the code in a way that you have a clear process to verify it. So things like where we take the measurements, how long we take the measurements, how you average it, that's probably more important than setting a limit. So the problem you run into is when it just says 65 is your limit, and a guy can go out for 30 seconds or he can go out for 5 days. So how to present that data is probably the most crucial thing. So, all right. All right, appreciate it, everybody.